We're going to have a kind of a wrap-up sermon on the topic of God. We've been talking about the subject of God now for about the last 10 weeks or so. And where we're going to move on from here is we're going to spend a number of weeks discussing Jesus in a very similar manner as how we've been discussing God. And then when we wrap up with Jesus, then we're going to move on to discussing the Holy Spirit. And a goal of mine in all this is to give us all some common ground to stand on in our lives as followers of Jesus in this place and at this time. Our world is currently going through a time of lots of changes and shifts in perspective on what it means to be human and who God is and what we are and how we are supposed to interact with God. This is a very unique time in human history. Typically, a worldview of a culture, a worldview of the general public, that can remain more or less the same for many, many, many generations. And history shows us that, for most of human history, people believed relatively the same thing that their parents and grandparents believed. But these days, it seems like each successive generation adopts a completely new and unique worldview, doesn't it? That's unique from their parents and their grandparents. Decade by decade, there are rapid shifts in our mindset regarding how we ought to think about the big questions in life, questions such as questions about God and questions about ourselves. And for followers of Jesus, we have an important calling to stick to what we know to be true in this time. Because what we know to be true about Jesus and what we know to be true about what he's done for the world and how only he can save the world and how only he redeems the world and rescues and restores anyone and everyone, these truths are for everyone. They apply to everyone. They bring salvation and freedom to anyone and everyone who accepts them, who takes them and asks Jesus to be the king of their lives. This is for everyone. But as I'm sure you're all very well aware, there are many other truth claims out there competing for the attention of those who are seeking a truth for themselves. And this can lead to lots of confusion about what we should believe about this world and what we should believe about God. So we do well to stick to the truth, stick to the scriptures, to help us combat the confusion that has taken a hold of just so much of the world around us right now. Sound biblical truths regarding God and humanity have largely been forgotten, especially in the West. That's why it's so important for us to be firmly grounded in the Scriptures, because Scriptures give us God's truth in these matters. But sometimes the truth as it's presented in the Scriptures, it's challenging, isn't it? This is a big reason why we've been spending a lot of time in the Old Testament lately, is because the Old Testament is a common source of challenge and a common target for people who want to maybe take a shot at God's character, to attack God's character. They typically use what they read in the Old Testament. And my hope is that this series has been able to bring in some context to what is happening in these stories, and my hope is that I've been able to shed some light on how we need to remember that God in these stories, he's always working to combat the awful, widespread, and prolonged wickedness of humanity. That's one of the big truths that the Old Testament teaches us again and again, is that humans, when left to their own devices, will fall into great wickedness. And God is patient in this. God is patient with humanity, but he does not tolerate humanity's sin forever. Eventually the day comes when God will step in and put a stop to the wicked things that people are doing. And the challenge for us is to trust that God's response at these times, especially these times that we read about in the Bible, the challenge is to trust that what God does and how he responds is a perfectly right and just response. God is the perfectly just judge, and he alone has the right to decide what the appropriate responses are to what is happening in the world. And we are called to trust him in that. But we must also be aware that there is an enemy who wants us to believe that God isn't just, that God isn't fair. And this enemy wants to plant seeds of doubt in our minds over God's goodness. We see this happening very much, we see this happening a lot today, don't we? There's no shortage of people today who doubt the good character of God, the justness of God, the fairness of God. The circumstances in their lives and the things they have experienced have led them to question how a good and all-powerful God could allow these kinds of things to happen. It's a common question. It's a fair question. It's a question that has been wrestled with for centuries. This question isn't anything new. This isn't a recent phenomenon that people have wondered this. And luckily for us, we have in our Bibles an entire book dedicated to looking at this question of why do bad things happen in the world. Talking, of course, about the book of Job, the famous story of righteous Job and the calamity that came into his life. And I think the story of Job is a good way to wrap up our time spent on the topic of God, because in this story we get a great case study of what is happening behind the scenes of human history. In the story of Job, we get an insider's perspective into some of the complexities of how God orchestrates history. And as always, the book of Job challenges us to trust that no matter what, God is righteous, and he is good, and he is worthy of our praise, even if our life circumstances don't make sense to us. And Job, Job is an extreme example. Job is an extreme case. He's an outlier. He lives a life that is more righteous than almost anybody else could possibly live, except for maybe Jesus. And in one day, he suffers a fate that is more terrible than I'd say most people have ever suffered in their lives. And so in Job, the inevitable question comes up: why did these things happen? And what's so special about the book of Job is that it gives us a rare glimpse behind the veil into the spiritual realm, where we see that Job is not the victim of random circumstance, nor is he being punished unjustly by God. Rather, Job has become a target of the enemy of God and the enemy of humanity, Satan. And as the story develops, it becomes clear that Satan's goal is to cause Job to walk away from God. Satan wants Job to curse God for the things that have happened to him. And why would Satan do this? What are Satan's motives for doing this? Well, I think that his motives can be known. But if we want to know Satan's motives, we first need to take a look at what his name really means, how the Bible talks about him. In the original language of the Old Testament, Hebrew, the word Satan is not merely the name of our enemy. The word has a practical meaning, I guess you could say. The word literally means accuser. In Hebrew, a Hebrew person, when they were reading their Bibles and they came across the word Satan, in their minds, for them, it meant accuser. That's what the word means for them. And this is a very accurate way of describing the actions of Satan here in the text. It's a fitting title for him. It's a fitting way to describe him. It's a fitting name that we could give him, because here in the story of Job, all Satan wants to do is accuse. That's his motive. That's his goal. He wants to accuse. He accuses Job of having alternative motives for worshiping God. He accuses God of playing favorites with Job and making Job's life too easy. All the accuser does is accused. But here in the book of Job, the accuser runs into a problem. Because with Job, there is no legitimate accusation he can make. Job is righteous and blameless. Satan has no accusation he can make against him. And he doesn't like it. So Satan tries to do something about it. So let's turn to the book of Job now, either in our Bibles or in the handout, and let's just see just how desperate the accuser is to cause the downfall of a righteous person. And let's see what we can learn from how Job handles this situation. We're going to start at Job chapter 1, and we're initially going to read verses 1 to 3. So Job chapter 1, verses 1 to 3. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. And that man was the greatest of all the men in the east. So not only was Job righteous and blameless, he was also extremely blessed. He had a large family. He had a large estate. He was a very unique man. His wealth and his power didn't lead him astray. His wealth didn't corrupt him. He didn't give in to temptations. He took his purity seriously. And not only his own purity, but the purity of his family. In the next verses, it goes on to say how Job made sacrifices for his children so that they too may stay pure, just in case they have sinned. He makes sacrifices for them. So this is a very unique man. He's a one of one, a wealthy man who maintains his integrity, and he has been blessed by God. We're going to skip down to verse 6 now. Job chapter 1, verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Now, this is one of those puzzling verses in the Bible. I'd say what stands out to most of us is probably the fact that Satan is here in God's presence, in God's space. It's a very unexpected thing to read, isn't it? It's a very unexpected development in the story. But he's not there alone, is he? Along with Satan, there's another named group present. In this translation that I'm using this morning, they're called the sons of God. Some of your translations might, instead of sons of God, some of your translations might have the word angels. If your translation does say angels, then what that just means is that the translators have they're making an interpretive decision for you. And they're using an equivalent word that maybe we are more familiar with. We're more familiar with angels than we are with sons of God. But in the original Hebrew, there's no other way to read it. It literally reads sons of God. And who are these sons of God? Are they different from angels? Well, no, not really. The sons of God are the created beings who live with God in the spiritual realm. That's where they are. So why are they called the sons of God? And why aren't they called angels? Because isn't it angels who live with God? Well, yes, you could say that. If you want to be nitpicky, if you want to find a way to separate the two, a very simplistic way to think about this is, just a minute. I said my kids were sick last week, and it was my turn to be sick this past week. So, still getting over a cold. What is the difference between sons of God and angels? If you want to be nitpicky about it, you could say that the sons of God are the ones that dwell with God in his heavenly space. They are the inhabitants of the heavenly spiritual realm, and they are there to worship God and to serve him and to do his bidding. The word angel describes what they do when they are sent by God to come interact with us here on earth, because technically the word angel means messenger. The word angel means messenger. It's a job title. It's a task that the sons of God do. So when God sends one of his heavenly beings here to earth, it's appropriate for us to call them angels because they are there by God's orders. They are acting as angels. They are acting as the go-between between us and God. And when they serve in that role, they have the job of being God's messenger, and we can call them an angel. I know this sounds nitpicky because really any son of God can serve as one of his angels, so they are equivalent terms. But just in case there's some confusion about the translations, there you go. That's why translators have different words here. So we have the sons of God coming before God, and we have Satan coming along with them. And they're coming into God's presence. And Satan's there, and what is Satan doing there? What purpose could Satan possibly have for coming into this space? And quite frankly, why is God even allowing him to be there? Well, the text doesn't explicitly say why God allows him to come. But again, let's remember what Satan's favorite thing to do is. Satan wants to act as the accuser. That's the role he wants. He's the accuser. He points out the faults in others. And to who? Who does Satan point out the faults to? He points out the faults to God. He points out the faults to the judge. Satan is the one who wants God's ear to say, "Oh, look at those sinners, look at what they're doing." Accusing humanity of being the sinners that, quite frankly, we are. We are the sinners. And for a time, it appears that in the Bible, there was a time when God allowed Satan to carry on with this role. However, the Bible also records that when Jesus came, Satan got kicked out of this role. We read about this in Revelation chapter 12, verse 10, where John writes, "Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, 'Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers and sisters has been thrown down, the one who accuses them before our God day and night.'" So that gives us an image of the kind of job that the Satan wants to do. He wants to stand before God and accuse humanity of all the sins that we do commit. We are sinners. We are worthy of accusation unless the blood of Christ covers us. In Colossians chapter 1, the Apostle Paul says that those who are in Christ are free from accusation. So with the coming of Jesus, the accuser, Satan, has been kicked out of God's presence. He's not allowed to accuse anymore. But at the time of Job, God still allowed him to be there. And why did God allow him to be there? Well, let's see how the story plays out. Let's continue reading, verse 7. "The Lord said to Satan, 'From where do you come?' Satan answered the Lord and said, 'From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it.' The Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil.'" So this is a repetition of what we read earlier. So twice now, Job's impeccable character has been highlighted. And this is God's assessment of him. This is what God declares to be true. And when the creator of the universe makes a declaration like this, who are we to question it? This is God saying what is true. And who are we to question it? But that's exactly what Satan does. He questions God's assessment. Verse 9, "Then Satan answered the Lord, 'Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But reach out with your hand now and touch all that he has. He will certainly curse you to your face.'" Something that we can't miss here is just how insulting Satan is being towards God. God has made his declaration regarding Job. God has said what is true about Job. And when God declares something to be true, all of his creation, including Satan himself, must submit to that truth. A big turning point for me in my understanding of this story is when I realized that, the only appropriate response that the Satan should have had when God was talking about Job was to bow to what God said and accept it as the truth. God said Job is blameless. But Satan didn't want to do that. Satan didn't want to be in a space where he doesn't have anything on Job. Satan wants to be able to accuse Job. So rather than submitting to, what God said and give God the proper respect and let the words of God stand as they are, Satan questions God's motives, and he tries to prove God wrong. You have to have a pretty high opinion of yourself to stand in the presence of the Lord God Almighty and say, "No, I think you're wrong, and I want a chance to prove it." But that is essentially what Satan is doing here. And he can't stand the fact that there might be someone out there who is able to resist him, like Job has been resisting him. And he wants a chance to test Job's loyalty and see if God's words hold true. Is God speaking the truth about Job? Is Job really the person God says he is? Satan wants to find out. And God gives him permission to find out. Verse 12, "Then the Lord said to Satan, 'Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not reach out and put your hand on him.' So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord." And we know what happens. We know that everything that Job has, including the children he loves, all of it is destroyed. Everything. And yet, in spite of this, Job does not do what Satan thinks he will do. He does not curse God. And so then after this, Satan doubles down. He asks for permission to strike Job's body and take away Job's health and leave him a broken man. And he gets permission to do this as well. And for the rest of the book of Job, the man Job wrestles with this question. Why did this happen? Why did this happen? Why did a just God allow such horrible things to happen to a righteous man? It's the exact question that we still hear today. If God is all-powerful, perfectly good, perfectly just, why do such horrible things happen to people who don't seem to deserve it? And the text makes it perfectly clear that Job didn't deserve it. In chapter 2, God says, after the first wave of attacks on Job, in chapter 2, verse 3, God says, he still holds firm to his integrity, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause. Without cause. There was no just cause for what happened to Job. And here, we might be wondering, why is God responsibility for what happened? Doesn't the story say that, Satan is the one who carried out these deeds? Well, I do believe that the nature and the magnitude of what happened to Job, I do believe that those things were thought up and carried out by Satan himself, but God gave him permission. God, as the sovereign, allowed it to happen. And this is where we really struggle. This is where the debate over God's justice lies. How can God be just and allow these things to happen to a person who God says is blameless? As always, we need to approach this with wisdom. The book of Job itself is wisdom literature. It's classified as wisdom literature, much like the book of Proverbs. And with wisdom literature, we are never, ever supposed to come to quick conclusions snap judgments. We were never supposed to read through the story once and decide what it means for us. The intent and purpose of wisdom literature is to make us stop and ponder and dig for what we might learn from what is being said. What do we know for certain? We know that this story is a part of God's Word. It's intended to be read. It's intended for us to read it. It's intended to teach us something about God. That's what wisdom literature is for. And I should say, it's intended to teach us something positive about God. Not necessarily something happy about God, but something positive about God. If all we can see right now is a negative picture of God from this story, then we're not done exploring what we might be able to learn here, what this text might be able to teach us. For starters, let me ask you a question. What could God have done differently? If we were God, what would we have done differently? We probably would have, kicked Satan out, not listened to him, and spared Job all of that trouble. Why didn't God do that? Why didn't God do the thing that, we think he should do? What could he have done differently? Well, I'm not sure that it would have been best for God to have done anything differently because, God isn't the one who is being inappropriate in this story. It was Satan. It was Satan who was defiant. It was Satan who wanted the trouble. But why did God let Satan carry out all of this? Well, for my part, this is a big, big debate. There are many, many different opinions at this point. Why did God allow this to happen? And I see two connected reasons that might just shed some light. That could be a part of our conversation as we wrestle with these texts. See, two possible reasons for why God might be allowing this. And the first reason revolves around the integrity of God and his status as the ultimate truth in the universe. If God is perfectly truthful, then no matter what he says must be true. And Satan is calling that into question. Satan is questioning and testing God's truthfulness. And, does God have to engage this? Doesn't God have the right to ignore this? Absolutely. God could just blow off Satan's accusations and ignore them. But in this case, he doesn't do that. In this case, God allows his truth statement to stand and be put to the test. And, as we know, it passes the test. At the end of the day, God is the one who comes across as being the truth teller in this story. And Satan comes across as being the one who is lying. Now, this, in and of itself, may not seem like much of a case for why God might allow these to happen, but let's pair this with the second reason that I see here. And that is that God is building an ongoing case against Satan over time that will one day see God judge and cast him into the lake of fire at the final judgment at the end of the age. Let's not forget that God is the judge over everything. God will make his final judgment against Satan one day. The Bible gives us hints here and there to the fact that everything that happens in history is recorded and will one day be used as evidence on the day of judgment. In Revelation chapter 20, verse 12, John says, "And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books." If God is doing that with us humans, I see no reason to doubt that God is also keeping an active record of all the The accuser's own actions will be used as accusations against him. God will turn Satan's acts against him one day. And I think it's fair to see God allowing the enemy the freedom to do these terrible things because God knows that this all will be used as evidence. This will all be used when he makes his final judgment. Here in the story of Job, both the true nature of who Satan is comes to light, and also the true nature of who Job is. The testimony that Satan gives for himself in this story is that ultimately Satan has no useful place in God's creation. That's the account that we get. Satan has no useful place in God's good creation. He's not even a good accuser, because when he's faced with someone like Job, he has to resort to cheating. He has to resort to alternative methods for finding a reason to have an accusation. In this story, Satan is showing himself to be utterly useless in and of himself. He brings nothing constructive or necessary to God's world. That comes out pretty clear in this story. So while Satan sought to condemn Job, he just ends up condemning himself. This is a story of Satan falling flat on his face in his efforts to knock a human being down. And isn't it remarkable that Job played his role in proving Satan to be a liar, to be incompetent, to be useless? Job showed Satan to be all those things without even knowing that that's what he was doing. Job is never informed of what God and Satan were doing behind the scenes. He was just being himself. He was just sticking to his integrity. But in doing so, he unknowingly heaped condemnation on the enemy. Just from being himself, just from being the blameless, righteous person he is, he heaped condemnation on the enemy. What does that say for us? Isn't it safe to assume that, we also find ourselves in these kinds of situations without knowing it? Isn't it safe to assume that, we find ourselves at the center of a spiritual warfare without knowing it? What kind of lesson can we take from Job? We stick to what is righteous and good. Even if we don't understand the reason why, we don't understand the background story of why this has happened, as we stick to keeping our integrity, to following Jesus, to affirming the truths about Jesus and his status as the Lord and King of heavens above and earth below, as the one who has conquered death, as the one who alone has the right to forgive sins, we stick to that. We show the enemy to be as faulty and without use and condemnable as he truly is. That we can do it simply by being what we are supposed to be. What an amazing lesson we can take away from this book. And this may not necessarily answer all of our questions. It's okay to continue to have questions. Wisdom literature is not supposed to be easy to understand right away. It takes time. If we need to go through the book of Job more and bring out more to understand more, that doesn't mean that we have failed on our first reading. But what we can most certainly know from this reading is that ultimately God's word must hold true above all else. There's nothing that can shame God into admitting that he was wrong about something. God's word must hold true. And, it's quite profound to think that the enemy is so wrapped up Satan's problem. Satan loves to make his problem be our problem. He loves to share his misery. But ultimately, Jesus has cast him down. Jesus has overcome him. Jesus never gave in to him, even though Jesus was tempted by him. Our role is to stick to what Jesus has taught us to do. Let's go to our Father now and ask him to help us be like Job. While we may not know, while we may not see, we know what it means to follow the one who called us to follow him. Let's pray. Father God, there's way more here than we could go through this morning. But I pray that the truth of what you accomplished in Job's life, in this story, that shine out to us. Lord, I pray that we be patient in our times of doubt. It's not wrong to not understand some things. It's not wrong to open up a book of Scripture and not understand. That's not wrong. Lord, give us patience. Give us the wisdom and discernment to understand more and more every time. God, it's hard for us to understand why we humans get caught up in a very terrible way sometimes in the interaction